Great. So here we are again. It's Tuesday, 9 a.m. So we're here for the Policy Leadership Academy, brought to you by Best Start, Antelope Valley. This is Module 9. So for some of us who have been together, this is almost the end. We've got Danielle, and then we have Daryl Doris, and then that's going to be it. So yay, this is almost the end. This is Module 9. We're super excited to have you here with us. A little bit about the Leadership Academy brings together stakeholders and community residents to understand and address local, statewide, and federal issues through a shared knowledge of causes and impact, current problem-solving frameworks, and best practices and actions to address change with an emphasis on policy. This just gives you a sense of the timeline. The timeline, we went through 5 weeks in August. Now we're at the last Tuesday in September, and we'll be together for 3 dates in October. Well, actually not 3. We'll be together for the first week, then we'll go dark, and then the last week will be a recap. So that's coming up. So that's in October. And today, the agenda, we'll have with us our speaker, Danielle Johnson. We'll have a Q&A followed, and then we will do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we're letting you go. So today is, as I mentioned, Danielle Johnson with Inclusive Growth Strategies. The topic today is managing diversity. So let me stop sharing my screen so I can introduce Ms. Johnson. Danielle Johnson lives by the mantra, think, speak, and act for yourself and your community. Danielle is the executive director of Wichita Habitat for Humanity and majority owner of Inclusive Growth Strategies and Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Consulting business. She prides herself on being an affordable housing advocate, conversation catalyst, inclusion and diversity educator, community mobilizer, and super volunteer. Danielle is a product of USD 259 Public Schools, a 2-time Wichita State University shocker with a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in public administration. Danielle is no stranger to board, committee, and community service, as she currently serves on the following boards: Community Operations Recovery Empowerment, Inc. for Wichita Urban Professionals, Rise Up for Youth, Wichita Branch NAACP, Health Core Clinic, and Leadership Wichita. Danielle has taken courses with Advanced Kansas Class 4, Kansas Leadership Center, Young Professionals of Wichita Leadership Academy, and Leadership Wichita. Danielle and her spouse, District 1 Councilman Brandon Johnson, are the proud parents of 3 children ages 17, 8, and 3. Danielle has extensive nonprofit and community engagement experience. Danielle sees the importance of representation and pushes to move the needle in the space she's in. Ultimately, what drives Danielle is her passion for our community as a whole, without ever forgetting the community is made up of individuals coming together. It's my pleasure to introduce Danielle Johnson.
Thank you, Tracy, and good morning, everyone. We're going to jump right on in. Excited to, there's a couple familiar faces on here. So for those of you that have seen some of these pieces, feel free to teach alongside me, right? Each one teach one, if you will. But excited to have you all. There's a couple of things that stand out on this first slide, and it says conversation catalyst. And you're probably wondering, what the heck? Where is that coming from? What does that mean? So I'll give you a little insight. Catalyst meaning an event or person that causes great change. That comes from our Kansas Leadership Center, the KLC, right here in Wichita, Kansas. That's where I'm hailing from. And there is a CEO there named Ed O'Malley. And that's some of the language that they share as far as being able to dub folks conversation catalysts. Myself and many others within our community believe in just creating the opportunity for conversation, but not only just the dialogue. Where are we moving forward with change? So please feel free to utilize that type of language as you move forward in your communities and organizations as well. I'll also add, I am remoting from home today, so I do have a sick kiddo. If you hear a coughing, croupy 3-year-old, my apologies in advance. If you see random mutes, I'm getting with my kiddo, but we'll keep rolling right on through. I know many of you all as caregivers understand what the hybrid life has to offer us here in the last couple of years. As we move forward, there are going to be 2 breakout options, and I really encourage engagement. Again, please feel free to utilize these as well, our engagement guidelines. As a catalyst, I reserve the right to halt the discussion and maintain order. I've been in a number of conversations and dialogues with folks that are adamantly opposed to one another, yet respect was still at the forefront. So my hope is that we continue to engage with one another respectfully, whether we agree on the topic or not. Embrace being reflective. There'll be moments where I ask you just to think about a specific question, a phrase. How does that sit with you? How are you feeling about what we're sharing? And reflect on how you might be already utilizing some of these practices or how you might not be. Wait, why am I talking? Why am I not talking? We are in a Zoom environment and we're still moving forward in this space, but I would ask, if you're someone that doesn't really like to share as much, or maybe you're a little bit more introverted, I would invite you to the floor first. We want to give you all the opportunity to be able to share. My sharers, my talkers, if you will, my super extroverts, I ask that you just wait for a moment to open up the floor for others to share. However, I feel like we're an intimate enough size of a group for those to be able to share that would like to. One mic, one person speak at the time, and land the plane, which is one of my personal favorites. Please feel free to say your question, say your statement. Oftentimes we are cautiously moving in conversations. We're going to utilize this space as an educational space. So we want to ensure that you all are just saying what you need to say so we can get to the heart of the question. And then if something needs to be corrected, we're going to assume good intent. It's easy to call someone racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic. There are a number of terms out there. What we want to do, though, is understand the essence of the question, understand people's backgrounds. How can we connect? How can we give grace, but also hold folks accountable for the things that we say and do? Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences, right? You still may step in it, and that's okay. As long as we're open to being educated, open to updating our language, understanding culture, respecting culture, having cultural humility, which we'll talk more about towards the end, we'll be able to continue to engage with one another. Stories stay and lessons leave. We're not to take out each other's stories as gossip, but how can we learn from one another? What are the principles that are already existing in this space? What are the successes, the missteps that we can learn from one another? But our stories are our stories. So I ask that we're respectful of each other's stories in this space. Lean into discomfort with grace and continue the dialogue with others. Oftentimes in diversity, equity, inclusion, or leadership tracks, you find yourself preaching to a choir. I would ask that you all share what you've learned in this space with those that don't agree with this information. That's the only way we can educate those around us. So who in your networks should be able to learn and understand about what you've learned today? You have to share everything that you learned in this academy, because I'm sure there's a lot of great nuggets that you can bring to others. Before I move any further, actually, those of you that are in a place and space to join me on camera, I would invite you to come on camera with me. Again, I know not everyone is able to do that, but if you can, it just creates more of an opportunity for us to engage more comfortably. So I will ask, if you are in a place and space to join me on camera, I would love to see your faces on screen. If not, that is okay as well. How many of you all engage in mindfulness? Mindfulness, right? There's a few folks, right? What we know in a lot of research work, that those that are intentional with their thoughts, with their breathing, their mindfulness, have the ability to be more engaged in a space, right? When we're not multitasking, but we're really just being in the space and taking in everything that we can. In this space, I ask that you try to stay as locked into the space as possible and be intentional with your breathing. Be intentional with where your head is at, your thoughts, your body, how comfortable you are in your seat. When you are here, you're going to be able to ingest as much of this information as possible. Please keep from wanting to check those text messages, those emails, those phones. We've gotten to a place where we'll just work right on through it, a meeting, a training, whatever that is. So I ask, let's be mindful and being mindful of one another in this space and really engage when we go into those breakout rooms, because this is an opportunity to practice what you are seeking. I ask that you all get what you need out of this session today by being as engaged as you possibly can, no matter where you are at. So we're gonna, we have about 45 minutes today, so it's gonna feel like we're running a race, but please ask your questions. Please feel free to stop me where you need to. We'll review some common language, go over some social identities, understand intersectionality, do a little intro into bias and policy, talk about an equity lens, and then action steps. We'll close with a little Q&A, and then I'm available for any additional things you may need after this. So we'll go right into breakout rooms. The questions that you all will be answering today is, do you have any apprehensions about engaging in equity, diversity, inclusion topics? If so, what are those things that you might be apprehensive about? If you're past apprehension and you're someone that says, I'm about it all day, every day, say that as well, right? Some folks are not apprehensive. Some folks are just uncomfortable even engaging in a dialogue when they hear the term diversity is going to be on the table. And then, have you engaged in policy work or advocacy? What are you doing in those spaces, in your personal, professional, organizational spaces? And maybe share some experiences. It's going to go quick. You have 6 minutes. So I ask that you go right into it and give space for folks to share briefly their responses.
Okay, and I'm opening them up right now.
Thank you. All right, welcome back. My hope is that you all have had some computer issues, so we'll just keep moving right on forward. If I can hear from just a couple of folks, 2 people specifically, what was some of that dialogue? If I can hear from 2 people that would like to share their responses to the questions.
In group 2, we were all on the same page. We're all pretty comfortable by this point in having the conversations and knowing we need to have the conversations and how it affects our work. And this group, everyone has actively engaged in advocacy. We threw one thing in there, which was, we know what to do. Now it's actually getting the world to implement what needs to be done. You know, it's not about us anymore. We've accepted it at our level. We just haven't, the world hasn't accepted what we've already accepted.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Donna, right? When folks are in the right space, but policy doesn't want to catch up and certain leadership doesn't want to catch up.
That's
Absolutely.
the way to say it.
Okay. Let me hear one other person, someone, any different perspective than that.
A little bit about, we were in group 1, and what we talked about was, amongst us, we're very comfortable engaging in these conversations and these topics, but always that you have to know who your audience is. Not everyone is ready to have those conversations, and so let's make someone uncomfortable when we bring it up. I think it's just really important, and the three, yeah, it's important to know who the audience is, who's there, who's not. You don't want to offend someone by saying the wrong thing if they're not ready to have that discussion. And then the second part, we're all engaged in the advocacy part. And something I brought up was, I strongly believe that you can't go into policy work if you're not the advocate. So knowing what the advocacy part is in order to make policy changes is really important. I feel like, just based on how, what we've seen in society, there's not a lot of advocacy on the policy end just yet. Yeah, that was about it.
Thank you for that. Right. So also it's the room that you're in, knowing your audience. And for me, sometimes folks ask, well, why didn't you just jump right in there? I don't want to lose the audience. So if I'm talking to a group of bankers, this message is going to be tailored a little bit different because I need to bring them along, and I have to have the patience to bring them along as a practitioner. Some folks can come in with the rah-rah, and that's good. You need that energy as well. But you will lose people the minute they feel like, ooh, you're talking about me, or, oh, you're not listening to my walk in DEI. You will lose a group. And then you have to balance what's more important, being able to stay in that space and educate over time, or losing the access to that space. And that's something that we all have to balance. And then the advocacy policy piece. Are you an educated advocate, or are you loud and wrong? And that happens too, right? Sometimes we'll let the anger get the best of us about an experience that we have, and we think that's a crappy policy. How do we do better? But we don't realize that you can create ripple effects and changes with your one experience with that policy. How does that experience ripple to everyone else and their experience with that particular policy? How do we show up as advocates that are educated on those issues? And how do those issues, policies, procedures, ordinances, laws, whatever is the language in your community, how is that affecting the people that we work alongside? What's the long-term effects? Because everything has a long-term effect. I've already kind of jumped into some of this language, but I believe in making sure that we're all using common language. Words mean a number of different things. I'm hailing from the Midwest. So for me, some things may be regional or more local, and you all might say, oh, you're using that word in this context. That means something totally different in our area in this context. So In this space, just a couple of words for your consideration. I've used a couple of acronyms already. IND, DEI, DNI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Inclusion, equity, diversity. I always think it's important as you are creating policies and plans, as you all are naming folks in your organizations, be mindful of the words that you use. Don't put words in policy that you don't actually utilize. If you say you do equity work, you need to back that up with some work. What does equity mean? What are the definitions in you all's organizations, places, and spaces when you utilize this language? So folks are not misconstrued on what you mean when you say diversity. Diversity in Wichita, Kansas looks vastly different than diversity in the Antelope Valley and anywhere else you're coming from. Diversity at Wichita Habitat for Humanity looks different than Best Start, looks different than Wichita State University, and all of those spaces. So what does it mean for your organization? In this space, we're saying diversity is the unique range of human differences. And I like to use the term facets. There are diversity facets such as race, ethnicity, gender, identity expression, gender identity, social orientation, political belief, ideology, right? There are these different facets. So when we say things like, there's no diversity in this space, diversity merely by definition always exists. There's always diversity. You may be lacking facets of that. Maybe you're a male heavy organization and you need to diversify in gender. Maybe you skew a little bit younger. Maybe everyone is a Libra. I don't know, right? But you have an opportunity to diversify what you mean in, or really get some language around what you mean. Implicit bias, also known as implicit social cognition, because we'll talk a little bit about that. And that refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect your understanding. Sometimes you'll hear folks say, we can eliminate bias. Well, you can't when it's a natural function of your brain and thought process. You can mitigate bias. You cannot get rid of bias. It's a part of your thinking process. So understanding that you have it and working to mitigate it and understand what your biases are in a space will make you stronger in your leadership, will make you a stronger human in this space, right? Because when we walk around and just accept our blind spots, we're not growing in our leadership. So understanding what our biases might be and where they're coming from is important. Inclusion, the involvement and empowerment where the inherent worth and dignity of all people are recognized and valued. So it's not just saying, hey, come to the table, I've included. It's come to the table and what are your ideas and how do we implement what you've added and shared, regardless of where you are in the hierarchy of our organization. Just being in the room at this point, especially when we're talking about advocacy, is not enough. Being in the room and being accepted and engaged with and having the opportunity to really create change policy, shape policy, that is true inclusion. And so in our own leadership, how are we ensuring that the voices that don't often get heard are in the space when we're creating policy, procedure, when we're working alongside organizations? How are we ensuring that the constituent, the client, are actually a part of said policy when we're creating that? Systemic, relating to or affecting the whole of a system. When we think about culture, culture is systemic. Systemic, when we think about systems theory, things are interrelated and interconnected. So what is the system? What is the system that you have to navigate in your workspace, in your organization? How are the policies created? Who created those policies? Who is represented at the policy making table? Who's on the boards? Right? So when we think about what the system looks like, it's hard to create change when the culture and the system don't align. So how are we ensuring we're looking at the systems processes? Equality and equity. Folks like to use this term interchangeably. They are not interchangeable. These are two different terms. Equality meaning the same, and quality, measure, or esteem, you're getting the same thing at the same time. Equity meaning fairness, justice. We're distinguishing from equality and saying, we're meeting you where your starting place is. Right, today we have our workshop, right? Equality says everyone is seeing this PowerPoint at the same time. Equity says, hey, we have someone providing Spanish interpretation. You'll be able to access this, the video with closed captioning, right? We're ensuring that everyone can truly access something at their level. That is equity. And so I'm sure you all have seen a number of these photographs in some way, shape, form, or fashion. This one is particularly my favorite one. So when we look at this, we see three people. The first half of the screen, you're seeing equality. Everyone gets a box, regardless if they can use it or not. Here you go. Here's your box. This gentleman doesn't need a box. She probably needs a couple more boxes. And then this person's going to need a ramp. Well, that's what's happening here in the second image, equity. He's standing just fine. Nothing needs to be given. This person is receiving 2 boxes and this person is receiving a ramp. To take it a step further, if we want to talk liberty, if we want to talk about justice, you would take down the fence, because you could just walk up or you could just be in the space and it's made for you. And this is where it gets kind of hard. There are some policies in place that create a space for you to only utilize equality and not equity. And you have to understand where maybe it's both and for you, where I'm creating equal opportunities and where I can, there's equity in place, because we do have laws and policies that are not just, but they are laws and policies. So how are we balancing both of these concepts as we move forward in the work that we do? I kind of spoke on this earlier, but again, when we talk about those dimensions of diversity, well, what are they, right? You have your personhood, if you will, you're at the center. You might call it personality, you might call it identity. And then in those rings, you just keep going out. So internally, you'll see things like race, age, national origin, right? Gender. Some of these things you might feel more salient. Some of these things might be your true identities. Some folks don't even engage with this ring. They just don't, it's just not a part of who they are. It's just an everyday thing for them. Externally, think about socioeconomic status, education, citizenship, parents, experiences, geographic location. How does dimensions of diversity show up in that external ring? Now, organizationally, are you union affiliated? What is your seniority or tenure in your organization? Where are you located? Your management status, your title, that plays into diversity, equity, inclusion. And then when we think about that furthest out ring, era, historical events, let's just think about what's happening right now. We've had no shortage of life-changing historical events. So what, as caregivers, we watched many of our children go to school on Zoom. Well, some of our children didn't have access to Wi-Fi, internet to go to school. So that created other issues. So we saw how maybe folks in a rural area and an urban area had to handle schooling. So there are all these different pieces, world events, political events, cultural events that help shape our view and how we engage with this thing we call diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we lead in that. We all have culture and we all have families or people, caregivers that pour into us something. And that's what shapes our interactions with those around us. Which leads me into social identities, and it gives you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself. When we talk diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's important to know who you are and how you fit in to your community, to yourself. And so I want you all to kind of consider a couple of things before we go into this conversation. But what is social identity? Well, when we think about Henry Tefel, he's a person who really put out the social identity theory. And this person states that this is based on someone's group memberships. And oftentimes we have folks in groups. It's easier for our mind to put people in boxes so that we know how to treat them. We know how to engage with people. And so we oftentimes just box people out. And that's not innately bad, but it's when we create the silos of us and them, and we divide and take resources away, and we legislate, and we use those types of things to harm community. So thinking about your own spaces and places, where do you tend to identify? Where do you tend to be boxed? These identities can be visible and invisible. They change over time. I talk about being a caregiver and my sick kiddo at home. Years ago, that was not a thing. I was able to just move and flow in the world. And now I have to stop and think, childcare, can I go? Can I go with my partner? Right? So those things change in your life. And then those identities, they intersect. How does privilege and oppression show up in these spaces? And we experience both privilege and oppression. And what is the difference for you over context and situation? So before we go into these next breakouts, if I can get my screen to move forward, you'll see a wheel here. And if you don't see something that stands out to you, please feel free to share some identity pieces for yourself or that represent you. But we have things like religion or spiritual affiliation, socioeconomic status, national origin, first language. I want you to think about those identities in the context of these questions. Consider how the various social identities have impact on your access to resources and to people in positions of authority, ability to direct your own and other people's work, authority to make decisions, and ability to influence through position or relationships. How does your identity show up in these different spaces, and what influence do you have, if any, based on some of those identities? You'll be in your breakout for about 6 minutes. So again, quick, brief points to be able to talk through. And then again, I'll hear from 2 folks, different people, when you come back from the breakout room.
Okay, then I'm going to open them up now.
So you know, everybody's back, all the rooms are complete.
All right, welcome back. We'll go ahead and and my apologies, I just said Sean because Tracy said Sean, but that wasn't your full name. Can you give me your pronunciation?
Sean Swain.
Sean Swain, okay,
Yes.
go ahead.
So what we talked about in our group, you know, inclusivity and how being inclusive, you know, affects.
Oh, you accidentally muted.
Sorry, I drew the comparison of inclusion and how that affects this community specifically, and communities like ours. And I drew it to, you know, my job where I work with Senator Wilk. And I talked about how, you know, there's a supermajority in the California Senate of one party. And oftentimes you will, especially in this last legislative session, you see that the governor would not support or would oppose or offer alternatives to something that the majority of his party wanted in the legislature. And I think that is because some of the things, because of a lack of inclusion there and that supermajority of maybe different types of Democrats, different types of ideologies or different type of approaches, or even just different backgrounds. Oftentimes you get legislation that comes out that is for a good intent, but ends up backfiring or hurting our community, you know, and that all settles down to, you know, are there enough people that think like us and in communities across the state, or that thinks like, you know, everyday people in inner cities and stuff like that? Is there enough inclusivity in the legislature? And if there was, would we get a better bill, so to speak?
Thank you for that. Yeah, especially in policy making. And as a lawmaker, those things can be very hard, especially if you're not proximate to communities or your good intentions, but impact versus intent. You intended one thing and the impact went vastly different. And I don't know how you all's legislature works, but here, to even run, the level of privilege one has to have to run and sit in a legislative seat doesn't always produce your, we'll say, common person. We hear from one other person. One other person that might want to share. Go ahead, Karen.
Great, thanks. I just, one of the comments that I had just had is in inclusion, just making sure that all people groups, all human groups are being represented, because I think sometimes there can be those who don't always have a voice, who can be significantly marginalized because they are requiring and that they are relying on other people to represent them, and how they are represented, how they're presented, how they're defined, how they are described by those who are making those determinations.
Absolutely, right. And that speaks to proximity. When you are elected or not, when you're in a space and you're representing community, how are you showing up for that community? Are you using the language that they want used? Are you ensuring that you're sharing their stories authentically and correctly? And sometimes we use this term of, I'm a voice for the voiceless. Everyone has a voice. How are we uplifting those that aren't heard? How are we engaging and getting them in the room so they can be heard and understood? What confidence boosting do we need to do when folks have been railroaded or feel like every time I go to vote or every time I go to speak, I'm not heard, or that hasn't changed, or that policy has been the same for the last umpteenth years? There's a level of suppression that happens at some point. You can't keep doing the same thing, accepting and expecting different results. So how do we ensure those that have been marginalized or oppressed, how do we engage them again when they've said, I've tried to be in the process? The process keeps spitting me out. I'm not heard. So how are we engaging in that work? Thank you all for continuing to have these conversations, and I hope that the conversation moves forward. Thank you for letting us know, Sean Swain, that you have another meeting. We look forward to engaging you in the future. So now you kind of heard me say this a little earlier, but intersectionality, many of us use this term. Well, a lot of times people don't know that it came from a woman by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw, very educated, very engaged in the term intersectionality. We're going to go ahead and get into just a quick clip. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and actually take this right to YouTube. Give me 1 second. Please let me know if you can't hear or see anything. Nothing is worse than not being able to hear and see something. And the closed captioning will be in Spanish.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. She applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. Heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, all of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
All right. So thank you for viewing that quick clip. Oftentimes we look at things as black or white, right? We sometimes live on we're not living on a spectrum and realizing that things are on a spectrum. Even in our own identities, we have the opportunity to identify in varying ways. And so how are we showing up in those spaces and honoring people in how they show up? I'm gonna quickly share my screen. And as we do our own policy work and we think about bias, and we talked a bit about implicit bias earlier and thinking about intersectionality, how does that show up in our work? Before I move forward, any kind of thoughts or things that you all might want to share based on the clip that I showed? Okay. So implicit bias, very quickly, we won't go in all of these things. We could do long stretches of conversations and workshops and discussions. I'm just going to give you some quick key things to consider when we think about implicit bias. What do I mean by that? I said earlier that you can't get rid of bias, but you can mitigate it. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, it happens in your brain. There's a couple of pieces in your brain. I'm certainly not a neurosurgeon. I can't go into the inner workings and operations of your brain, but I can talk about at a higher level what is happening in that space. And when we think about the amygdala, it is truly that powerhouse processing space, fight, flight, or freeze. You know how to react very quickly, or your brain will react for you very quickly in situations. Your hippocampus is the space where your brain forms information, where your memories are processed. That's where that linkage happens. Your temporal lobe integrates your sounds and your words, and then the medial frontal cortex, that's empathy, emotional response, rational thought. If you know anyone that has damage in those spaces, sometimes there's a delayed reaction or response, or there isn't a lot of emotional or empathetic rational thought happening in the frontal lobe, right? So there are some things that can cause blockages to some of these particular experiences in our brain. Folks with severe mental illness, there are a number of things that can happen in these spaces, but when everything is functioning together, your brain is processing 11 million pieces of information per second. Unconsciously, your brain processes 11 million pieces of information per second. You can consciously process about 40 pieces. So you see the difference where your brain is just working and filling in gaps for you and creating thought processes. And if you're not actively involved in that, you don't have to be, right? How many of you all have ever driven home and looked up and said, man, how did I get in my garage? How did I get home? Or you're going somewhere and you're doing something totally different. Your mind has just went into overload, or you just go into autopilot, if you will. That is how your mind is shaped. Oftentimes when folks see criminal activity, they need to get that information quick, because your mind will start filling in gaps. Well, I saw a gentleman that was Black. Well, I saw a gentleman that was brown, right? You get these competing values because your brain just wants to fill in information. And we have to be mindful of the thoughts that we think and the things that we say and understand where they come from. That is where bias lives. And so we have to actively work to mitigate that. Well, here's just something I want to engage with you all on. When we think about individual bias and institutional. So a scene, and I'm just going to read this verbatim. A middle-aged manager and her new employee, a young woman just out of college, approaches an information booth at a Midwestern city. The manager, highly educated, fashionably dressed, and a Hispanic, asks the woman behind the counter for directions. Rather than giving the rather complex directions to the Hispanic executive who just asked the white woman behind the counter, addresses only the new employee who was also white. It happens all the time, says the executive as the two walk away. She suggests that the woman in the information booth probably didn't even realize she was behaving in a subtly biased manner. For her, on her part, the young white woman is too embarrassed to admit that she barely took note of what happened until her new boss pointed it out. Well, what happened here? What do we see happen in this situation? Who might want to share, or have you all experienced something similar? I'm seeing some head nods, right? Is this blatant racism? Is the lady behind the counter racist?
I would say she's not. She,
Okay.
like the lady said, and this has happened to me, she probably didn't even notice what she had done. And in this particular case, I feel like it's more, you tend to go to what you know, or you address what you know. And perhaps she just acknowledged the lady that was white because that's her race. So she maybe just did unintentionally.
Yeah, right. And then also remember intent versus impact. The lady, there was someone that asked a question, but you responded to the person that didn't ask the question, right? There could have been some bias in there. Blatantly racist? No, I would agree, Elvie. I don't think that this person is blatant. Maybe, you don't always know someone's heart and head either. I don't know what the thoughts were going on in this person's head, but this is an opportunity for us to be reflection moment. When we're engaging with people, who do we tend to engage with? Who are we comfortable engaging with? And who are we not comfortable engaging with? What language makes us uncomfortable? How do we feel about some of the social things when we think about the Me Too movement? When we think about Black Lives Matter? When we think about these different terms and things that show up, how do we truly feel about them? Go ahead, Keith.
I was thinking about this scenario that you were talking about, and I think this is why it's so important that we continue to have these conversations. I think we are programmed to a certain extent. Even me being a person of color, I had to catch myself a couple of times stereotyping my own people based on what we watch on the news. I mean, it's changing now. You see more diversity and this and that, but those type of things take a long time to change. And I think that it is sometimes so deeply, I want to say, we've been brainwashed so deeply that people are unconscious that they're even doing things like that. But the person, for example, on the receiving end, if I was that other employee, I would have been like kind of, not feeling good about that, wondering, my first thought is going to be she's racist. Although she probably is not. It's just she's more familiar with a certain look and this and that and the other. That doesn't necessarily make her racist, but it still impacts, as you said, the person on the other end of it to a very, very large degree. And I've seen a lot of people whose spirit is just dead because they feel like there is no possibility in their lifetime or their kids' lifetime of seeing this diversity, equity, and inclusion really being what it's supposed to be in the first place, because we're all one human family.
Yeah, thank you for that. Right, and we do it to our own. I think sometimes people of color are not exempt, right? It's not just a white-black conversation. It's a larger conversation. Years ago, someone had to like lightly check me because an interpreter and a person walked up and the person was speaking and I was speaking to the interpreter. Well, that's a faux pas. You speak to the person. The interpreter is just translating and sharing information. You don't speak to the interpreter. You speak to the person asking and answering the question. And I had to take that, right? My intention was not to be disrespectful, but I had to understand I had not ran into this. So how do I educate myself in this space? So really, how are we showing up in those spaces, and how are we mitigating our own biases? Implicit bias is usually thought to affect individual behavior, but how is bias showing up in our institutional practices, right? People create institutions. People are systems. When we say things like the system is holding us back, let's take a step back. It's also people. People are systems. So how are we ensuring that we are mindful? For example, many institutions adhere to certain practices that disadvantage a subset of the institution's members, such as, let's say, some universities holding faculty meetings at a time when parents are most likely, or caregivers are most likely, to pick up children at daycare, which discriminates against your caregivers, right? How many of us have woken up early in the morning as caregivers? We have a meeting at 7:55 a.m. Well, we got to take kids somewhere at 7:55 in the morning. So you're splitting your household, or maybe you're the only caregiver and you have to figure out how to get there. Well, where do those kind of rules come from? Well, institutional bias usually is not deliberate, but schedules, for example, were often established at a time when mostly men were faculty members, married men to women who stayed home with children. Thus, it is important to consider how past biases and current lack of awareness might make an institution unfriendly to members of certain demographic groups. So thinking about what the workforce used to look like and what it looks like today. And how are we looking at these policies? Now, sometimes you just can't get away from the 7:55 a.m. meeting. So I'm not saying do away with all meetings, but I am saying, how are we mindful of those that can actually make it? How are we mindful of attire? So as we're becoming a even more multi-generational workforce, and we talk about young professionals, well, do they have the attire? Right? And let's not even talk age. Sometimes we set rules and policies to say, you can't have tattoos, you can't do this, you can't do that. How does that affect your ability to be efficient and professional? And what are we deeming as professional? Regardless of my attire, am I still doing my job? And is it necessary? Do you need a PhD to do this job? Or are you adding extra barriers to entry of workforce? Is this a teachable skill, or is this a skill you truly have to carry a degree? And how are we looking at our policies and procedures as we're looking to diversify our organizations? When we think about that equity lens, are there some pieces and things that we can be considering when we think about equity, be it in housing, education? What are the lenses to look through? And how are we leaning into, I like to use the terminology, radical empathy? We can't know what it's like to walk in everyone's shoes. We just can't, but we can empathize, right? We can try to parallel our experiences. And sometimes those experiences will never be the same, but how do we empathize and understand? The equity lens is an intentional inclusion in decision and policy making. The focus is on both the process and the outcomes. An equity lens oftentimes centers underserved or marginalized populations. When we think, sometimes there's this saying, when you're kind of level setting and all rising tide lifts all boats, that saying. Well, yes, a rising tide, but if there's an abyss, how much water needs to flow all the boats, right? We are all not going to move forward together if we're not engaging with those that are the most impacted. And who are the most impacted? Who are the most marginalized? And when we kind of center in that space, we're able to kind of get everyone to a higher level playing field. So some questions for your consideration, and Tracy, I'll make sure that I send this information over to you all so you all have it. So don't feel like you have to write everything down. You'll have these resources. But when you think about the social political landscape, what are the equity issues in this space? What needs to be addressed? What's a concern? What does the larger historical and socio-political context affect this issue, and how do people experience it? Oftentimes folks want to leave history in the past. The past is in the past. That happened 400 years ago, 500 years ago. Not true. Things happen and then they shift and change. How do you see the shifts and changes if you don't even look at or know the history? Know the history of an issue so you can attack it at all levels, and see how laws and policies have intentionally held folks back. Redlining, look up the redlining in your community. If you're not aware of redlining, look it up, understand it, right? There's facts in history and then there's opinion. I would say drop the opinion for a few seconds to learn the facts of the policies and procedures that have marginalized communities, all types of communities. Personal lens, how might your own intersectional social identities and biases affect how you are seeing an issue? Oftentimes we find ourselves saying, that's never happened to me, that's not true, or I know someone from that community and that never happened to them. How are we mitigating our own biases and not utilizing our own walk as just pure truth and fact, but how are we really looking at a full issue? How might others' intersectional social identities and biases affect how they are seeing the issue? And how are they impacted by the issue? How are we understanding what's happening around us? I love this, read the room. We know folks that will just say anything and they're like, "Ooh, this is not the right room for that." How do we read the room? Whose voices and experiences are being included or highlighted? Are the people being impacted included in the decision-making process? Are their voices and perspectives truly being heard? Do the folks being impacted have any power? What power dynamics are at play in the process of decision-making or addressing the situation, and whose cultural norms, values, and standards and perspectives are reflected in the process and actions and decisions, right? Who are we norming? Who are we saying this is the standard and everyone has got to be that standard? It's important. And the power piece is important as well. Folks with no power can't change their own power dynamic. So allies, advocates, those of us that have access, that's our role, that's our job. But how are we making sure that we're bringing their voice and amplifying what they're already saying? Impact, how might this action, decision, service, or policy affect people with different social identities? Does this action increase a sense of belonging and access to resources, opportunities, and power for people from underrepresented or marginalized groups? How might this action unintentionally advantage people from dominant groups and disadvantage people from underrepresented or marginalized groups? And what are some ways to ensure equitable impact or outcomes? How can the change be sustained? Because sometimes we will get communities excited because we put something in place, but there's no resources. So the funding is only for a year. The funding is only for 2 years. Or we put something in place and the impacted community can't even access the business loan because they can't get a traditional loan, right? So how are we thinking about when we create these policies and say, there's resources everywhere? Well, how much money has been moved? Oh, none. You put 2 million away and only 2 folks access the $2 million pot? Well, what's the barriers? Those are the questions we have to ask. So ongoing, as I kind of end here, our action steps, we want to bias mitigate, we want to counteract, we want to set our expectations, and we certainly want to lean into cultural humility. I spoke about this earlier, but we got to think about our own biases, right? When we hold women back because they're in childbearing age, well, why? Right? Let other folks give you their no. And even in the simple day-to-day things, you know, Tracy's always on the run. She's always busy. She already serves on a million boards. Don't even ask her. Let Tracy's no be her no, right? When we bring names to a table, talk about folks holistically and then give the ask and let folks tell you that they can't do it. We can't make assumptions on when we think someone wants to have a child or not. Some women don't even want to have kids, not on the menu, right? Some folks, no matter their age, are prepared for that next level. How do we give them the opportunity? What are we putting in place to make sure that folks are being successful? When we think about accessibility and we want to diversify with those that may have disabilities, how do we make sure that everyone has the equitable access to be promoted, move forward? What are the policies and procedures that may inadvertently be disadvantaging and holding people back? What are we doing to actively counteract our own biases? We know we have them. We need to accept we have them. Well, where do they come from? Are they factual? How did we learn them? How do we dismantle some of those thought processes and relearn? We have to deconstruct and relearn, right? We all learned that Thanksgiving was this amazing holiday and the Pilgrims and the Native Indigenous folks loved each other. Well, now we know something different happened, right? Now we know that maybe Columbus Day isn't the best day in the world. There are things that we learned and were programmed to understand that we're now realizing maybe this language isn't okay. How do we educate ourselves? Review your policies and procedures. What's been the latest updates? What policy no longer needs to be on your books? If you're not following it, why is it there? So there's some handbooks that need to be reviewed. There's some things on your website. Audit your print material. What's going on in those spaces? Be aware of the cultural norms of your organizations and the organizations you work with. How is that reflective? If the policies on your books don't make sense, we need to look at them and recreate or ensure that we're also following our own ordinances and laws and those sort of things. And then sometimes we have to question those things. Learn the language. Maybe it's understanding the pronouns. Maybe it's people first language, learning the language of your communities, and then setting the expectation. So equity, diversity, and inclusion starts at recruitment, and those efforts are showcased and tracked in retention. We can front load folks, but if they won't stay, you have a culture issue. So is there a culture problem? And before you start recruiting, what's already in place to support the communities that you have? How do the people, regardless of how they identify, how do they feel in your organization right now? What's going on in those spaces? When we think about being reflective, what are the metrics, right? When we put goals in place, what are those goals and what are tangible about those goals? Do we want to be reflective of our census data? Do we want to make sure that we have affinity groups because we don't have enough folks that look like one another, or maybe we're too homogenous? What are some of the things that we need to be mindful of? Benefits, flexible time, professional development, affinity groups. There's all types of ways to engage across your organizations. And then what does upward mobility look like? Training, mentorship, matching, right? There's some things that are not costly. Sometimes I provide these ideas and folks hear dollar signs. There are free things that you can do right now before you leap into some of those dynamics. And then lastly, cultural humility, a lifelong commitment to learning about critical self-reflection. We are always learning. We're a global society. Even as a D&I practitioner, I don't know everything. I don't know every topic. So I have to be willing to learn and be educated. Desire to fix power imbalances within provider-client dynamics within your own organizations. And then institutional accountability and mutual respect. Partnership based on trust. Just being nice alone is not going to move the needle forward. So we have to get out of this attitude that, you know what, I'm just going to be nice and respectful and everything will fall into place. It's intentional action, reading, education, and engagement that will help move our DEI practices forward. So that being said, I want you all to take some time to reflect and check in. I see some questions in here that I will be answering here in a moment. Just quickly for you all, personal impact statement. How will this session inform your policy and advocacy work, your diversity, equity, and inclusion work? What are you committed to doing to impact change with what you have learned or maybe have honed in this space because you already knew the information? And what are you going to do to succeed in your commitment? Because it is just that, a commitment, and a commitment without currency is counterfeit. So what are you going to put in place to ensure that you are moving this work forward? And then lastly, I love Audre Lorde, a self-described Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet, if you will, dedicated her life to creating talent and confronting and addressing injustice through racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia. She says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So how are we moving these issues forward with some intersectional thought processes? And you all will get these resources as well. So let's jump into the Q&A portion. I'm going to stop my sharing. I see some stuff in the chat. Sorry, I didn't miss anything. How do we ensure that addressing intersectionality doesn't create a greater divide in society and that we don't start weighing various categories to create a new classes that breed new feelings of discrimination? That's a great question. And that's something we do have to be mindful of. There's this thing of being too inclusive, right? Sometimes you have to look at what is the biggest issue within your community and how are you attacking that issue. So there can be some divides within society, and there already is, right? But it's how you come to the agreement on this is the issue that we're moving forward and this is the why, and being clear and concise about the issue and the why. Why are we focusing on this? Well, historically, this has been the issue. This is who has been left out. This is where the marginalization is truly happening. This is the least resourced space. And how are we attacking that particular issue? I don't know if that clearly answers your question, but you do have to be mindful. There's a conversation on even the use of the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Well, sometimes you have Black folks that say, I don't want to be lumped into all of this. We need to fix our issues now. So it's understanding the community that you're working with and making sure that we're all moving forward with that particular issue and why we're choosing that issue and why maybe my organization does this work and your organization can focus on the broader group, but I'm doing Hispanic work right now, or I'm doing work with those that have disabilities, and this is why. But we'll connect down the road once we've shored up this particular issue.
Thank you. That does help. It's kind of like either coming to a common agreement if you can, or finding different spaces in which to work if you seemingly can't.
Right, right. Because there's always somebody doing something. Places are very resource rich.
Definitely.
Other questions?
Danielle, would you mind putting the diversity wheel back up, please? I would like to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Get to that slide. Okay.
And as Danielle mentioned, I will be sharing the slides. We'll be sharing the slides with the group, so you'll have these.
Anything we didn't discuss or I missed? Well, if not, thank you again for your time, and I'm excited to hear how you all felt or thought about this. I love the survey information, so please be brutally honest so I can always do better in the future. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Danielle. If we could get a virtual or an actual round of applause. Danielle's been doing a couple of our sessions on diversity, and I always learn something new. So thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. I know we've got we're almost at time, so let me just share my screen real quick so we can do the housekeeping. Let me just, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so again, our group side, I always mention this. I will actually be putting a question from Danielle's slideshow on the group site this afternoon. So again, we just want to create a place where we can share ideas and have some thought-provoking questions as we move forward. So that will be this afternoon. So I urge you to go over there and answer the question if you'd like. Again, we want it to be interactive for you. So that will be our group site, and that is this afternoon. I will post that. Also follow us on Linktree. As always, I mentioned that this is brought to you by Children's Bureau and by Best Start Antelope Valley. And so we have our Linktree, and we also have our Facebook. We have our Instagram. So if you're interested in following us, please do so. We would like you to do that, and I'll have my colleague Stephanie put the Linktree into the chat, or Darrell if Stephanie cannot. And then finally next week. So as I mentioned, yeah, it's crazy, but we are almost at the end. Daryl Doris, council member for the city of Lancaster, will be our final speaker next Tuesday, October 4th. Yes, we are in October. Managing legislators is the final topic. We will be dark the next week after, and then the final week will be the recap, where we'll have a recap video. We'll ask you to fill out the survey, and then that will be our final session. And again, you'll be getting those weekly announcements as you have been. So you don't need to write anything down. You'll get my emails. And then finally, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time. It's a Tuesday, so we're not quite in the middle of the week, but we're getting started. So for those of you who have joined us today, we really appreciate your time. We will be sending you, as I mentioned, the slideshow that Danielle will send me, and you'll also be getting a recording of the video. So again, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next week with Daryl Doris, City Council member with the City of Lancaster. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your week.
Everyone, have a great day.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye. Have a good one, Denise.